Hi everyone, thank you for joining our webinar today on Put a Price on It DC, the proposal to establish a carbon price in the District of Columbia. We have a great presentation today and a lot of people who've been working really hard to move this proposal forward. So we're going to have a presentation explaining the proposal and its economic impact, as well as some perspectives from a business owner and the council, and then we'll dive into questions. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please send them in via the chat function. Send them in whenever you have them, because if we see a question come in that's relevant to a section that was just discussed, we'll be able to pose that question if necessary right then to clear up any questions. So again, please use the chat function if you have any questions. For those of you who don't know, I'm Eliza Kelston. I work for the American Sustainable Business Council. This slide can just tell you a little bit about ASBC and what we do. So we represent over 200,000 businesses across the country, and we are an advocacy group that works at the state and federal level. And carbon pricing has been something we've been working on now for a number of years, both at the federal level as well as the state. We've been doing a lot of work in New England, as well as engaging with Camila and the others at CCAN on this new DC proposal. So we're very excited to host this webinar today. Another exciting upcoming event that we're doing is our Sustainable Business Summit, which will be in just 3 weeks in October 22nd through 24th. So if you're interested in attending that event, we'll even be doing some lobby visits on the Hill on carbon. So if you're interested in participating in that, please reach out to me and we can talk about getting you registered. And the last thing I just want to say is thank you to our co-sponsors for the webinar. We've had a great group of people working to put this together, and you can see everyone's logos up on the screen. So thank you everyone for your participation. I'm now going to start the presentation by introducing Asada Harris. She's with the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, and she's going to kick it off by talking about carbon pricing.
All right, thank you so much for having me. I just want to say my name is Asada Harris. I'm the DC community organizer. I'm really excited to be a part of this campaign. There's so much grassroots movement and feeling behind this. For over 2 years, our campaign has conducted careful multi-stakeholder engagement, as well as in extensive community outreach for input into this policy design. So that's been really amazing, having everyone voices heard at the table. And Washington, D.C. is actually the nation's highest concentration of voters who are alarmed about climate change. And we have found that residents and businesses alike are especially motivated to take action given the Trump administration's assault on common sense climate and energy policies. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to my colleague Camila to tell you more about the policy and this great coalition.
Thanks, Asada. Right, so as Asada said, there's been a lot of momentum building behind this policy now for a number of years. We've been working with, at first, 6 organizations and now a coalition of over 40. And I think there'll be a slide coming up soon that represent, as you can see, small businesses in the district, clean energy companies, social, environmental, and economic justice groups, think tanks, faith groups, labor, the whole gamut, many organizations that have never worked together. And that's because we see this as both smart climate and environmental policy and smart economic policy. When we put a price on carbon, we stop our local dollars from flowing outside of the district to support countries like Saudi Arabia or states like Texas, where those the fossil fuel industry is actually extracting fossil fuels, which we don't do in the district, which makes this the perfect place to finally pass what economists from all ends of the political spectrum have long said is the #1 sensible climate policy. And that's, again, putting a price on carbon with a carbon fee, which is the most straightforward and predictable way to transition to a clean energy economy. And we're really excited about the proposal that we've put together because it has been the fruit of so many years of careful input from our coalition partners. Briefly, the proposal outline is that we begin pricing carbon pollution at $20 a ton and increase steadily by $10 every year to reach a cap of $150 a ton in the year 2032. And that would begin generating about $140 million of revenue in year one, increasing to nearly $600 million of revenue again by that peak in 2032. With some variability, because of course we don't know exactly how quickly we'll be able to transition to clean energy. Those numbers are very conservative, but we think we can do a great job of that in a district where there's already so much momentum in place. The revenue would be used primarily returning to residents in the district, since they will see energy prices, dirty energy prices increase. And the return of revenue on a flat per capita basis makes this a progressive policy that reflects the values of the district. Those checks or electronic bank transfers would go out on a regular basis, leaving the majority of households better off than they were before. We also have a total of 25% of the revenue available for clean energy investments and business tax credits. And we're leaving those tax credits undefined for the time being because we really do want to have business input. And that's why we're really glad that you all are on this call. But the estimate is that there'll be at least $30 million worth of those business tax credits, the value that recycle back to small business in the district. And we have a net positive effect on GDP and jobs, which Scott will go into, because when people get that money back, they're going to be spending it in the district on local goods and services. So I'll wrap it up there. We'll send out a lot more information tailored to business concerns at the close of this call. But I'll finally note that, you know, the support that's been growing is really remarkable. And even the Washington Post in May editorialized in strong support of this policy, calling it a thoughtful proposal that they hope other states follow. So we hope that with your support, we'll be the first in the country to pass a large-scale carbon fee. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Camila. So we're now going to move on to Scott Williamson from the Center for Climate Strategies, and he's going to dive into the economic analysis of the proposal.
Hi, everybody. This is Scott. It's very good to meet you. I work with a group called the Center for Climate Strategies. We got brought on sort of as an advisory helper to this campaign. We're a 501c3, so our work is not advocacy work. We provide analysis and support to advocates, governments, and other groups that want to understand the policies that they're interested in. And so that's been our role as part of this process. And fundamentally, what we've done here has been to provide a macroeconomic impact study using sort of the benchmark classic REMI policy insight tool that a lot of state agencies and governments throughout the country are using to do this kind of analysis and to figure out the kinds of economic questions that they have. Fundamentally, we're focusing on trying to understand the impacts to the sort of standard top line economic impact figures people care about, which, you know, employment impacts, income impacts, GDP impacts, which we can look at either overall, or we can start to break out by subparts of the economy, productive sectors and households, things like that. So if I can go on to the next slide. Again, this quick summary of what Camila just said. You know, we're talking about a carbon fee and rebate. These have been looked at a lot of different ways in a lot of places. They can vary from place to place as to how they're designed, what fuels you tax, how aggressive you price it. But most importantly, this element and the second bullet is the one I wanted to focus on, which is that we're talking about a price signal here. The idea is not to impose this fee as a punishment. It's to announce the fee many years in advance and to get people a lot of time and opportunity to take measures that become cost effective, or at least moderately cost effective, as ways to avoid running into that fee at all. In this case, that's the purchase of clean energy and other methods to be more efficient. There's efficiency and then clean energy options to avoid the fee entirely. So we looked at that as well. You know, we wanted to build that into the assumptions here. And then finally, as Camila said, the whole point is to return every dollar collected back to the economy in the year that it's taken out. So it's not squirreled away or sent out of the district, it's returned to the economy in a mix of ways. And if I can go to the next slide. So again, just sort of very quickly, one of the appeals to this is that it creates an incentive. It creates a more cost-effective balance for cleaner suppliers of energy. They don't have their fuels burdened by the fee per megawatt per ton if they're not producing a lot of emissions at all, whereas suppliers of dirtier energy do. So it shifts the relative price of energy sources. It creates an incentive, and it has an appeal of being very simple to implement and simple for compliance purposes, rather than a sort of cap and trade mechanism, which tends to require active tracking of a carbon market and someone who's skilled in responding to that carbon market, carrying out trades, et cetera. You end up just having, you know, an accounting of your energy, which most companies and most entities do already, and then an accounting of the carbon bill to that energy, which would come out of the agency using fairly commonly collected data on emissions intensities. So it's intended to be an efficient and low overhead kind of policy design. If I can go to the next slide. So this tax goes to really three areas, which are electricity, gas, and transportation. And in this case, the fee is applied to the suppliers as they bring the energy into the district. We assumed that all that burden would get passed through 100% to the consumers of the energy. I wanted to point that out up front, because a lot of times people will be worried that we've made rosy assumptions that this money this cost will not be passed through. We did assume 100% of it would be passed through. For transportation, because we were worried about leakage, people buying their fuels outside the district rather than inside, we avoided a direct price on emissions at the pump or on suppliers, and we shifted to approaches to the excise tax and fees on parking meters and garages. And that was a mechanism we chose specifically because the district is a very small region geographically, and it's easy to simply displace the demand out to Virginia or Maryland. It also creates a little bit of an opportunity to identify commuters and tourists as participants in the payment of this fee, because they also contribute to a lot of the use of transportation services in the district. Finally, there's the offset to business taxes, to business costs. Part of the reason we put this in there as we went through this, we ran this a lot of ways, was to make sure that we weren't simply establishing a burden that would push businesses to want to relocate outside the district. The purpose was to try to get a change in energy use, not just a relocation of those who would be encountering a fee. And that's what was most important. So we put some scenarios into the analysis where we really tried to reduce the burden or offset the burden through using some of the revenue specifically to offset these business costs and try to keep businesses from thinking about having to leave the district. Can we go on to the next? Thank you. So, I mean, the big takeaway was that we identified a pretty substantial emissions reduction from this. I mean, that is, again, the sort of foremost purpose of any emissions reduction policy. And in this case, it's quite large. We're talking about several 100,000 tons of emissions per year against the baseline, which we already did not expect DC's emissions to grow rapidly over the next 15 years. They were going to peak, according to a lot of sources, in the late 2020s and then start to fall. This policy would effectively mean that that peak happens now and that the policy effectively holds flat before it begins to fall without having risen throughout the early 2020s. And so we end up, rather than being at 7.5 to 8 million tons per year, we're at more like 6 million tons coming out of the economy. And this is based on some fairly conservative assumptions, we basically decided that DC was too small to drive a massive rearrangement in the electricity supply in the Mid-Atlantic, which is the largest distribution network in the United States. And so we figured DC wouldn't really change all of the PJM electricity mix. We would end up relying almost entirely on efficiency measures and use changes, rather than on a sudden explosion of wind power and solar all throughout the region, just to sort of respond to this one policy. And even still, we're talking about cutting effectively 1 ton out of every 4. So it's quite substantial. And this is in addition, I want to point out, to the renewable portfolio standard, which we treated as already in place. If I can go to the next. We ran a lot of scenarios to look at the economics of this, and we wanted to identify those scenarios that would do well, that would keep the economy whole or help it grow even further. The baseline is that the economy is going to grow in DC. The number of people will grow, the number of jobs will grow, the amount of productivity will grow. And we wanted not to interfere with that, and if we could, to contribute to it. And so we were using this tool as a way to test different scenarios and get to that kind of a policy design, while we met other goals as well, of course. In the end, we are talking about now this scenario. Basically, it adds about 525 new positions to the economy by the year 2032. So it's a very slow, steady increase of a little under 1/10 of 1% of the total employment in the district. It doesn't land everywhere. Of course, within a broad economy, there are winners and losers. The direct spending on infrastructure and efficiency that's going to be used, that's going to come from a chunk of this revenue, does benefit construction. The significant outlay of the revenue to households so that they can then have that money in pocket benefits retail sectors, nightlife, and healthcare very, very much indirectly. So the money doesn't go directly to those sectors, it goes to consumers who then spend it in those sectors. What we saw losing jobs was we saw, as a result of the sheer efficiency impact of the response to this policy, we saw utilities becoming slightly smaller in scale. And then consulting, legal, and technical services, people like me, basically, we saw less of that in the district as well. And we attributed that to the fact that those are sectors that don't face the consumer very much at all, but they would encounter, just like anybody else, they would encounter the price on dirty energy. But in the end, the story I think that's most important to take away is that this had effectively the result was that we held the economy where it was going to be without this policy. It's not a substantial increase, but it also has a massive effect on emissions without imposing any decrease or dislocation to not only jobs, but also GDP, income, value added, and total output. All of these stayed at 99.9% or up to 100.1% of the baseline. So we expected a certain curve going on without this policy. That curve stays in place in terms of the story of DC's economy with this policy in place. The next slide. So I want to tick through these really quickly just to show you how all the elements add up. This slide shows that if we just impose the price on carbon to households, we're going to see jobs, total employment in the district fall as a result of the burden on household consumption. They're going to be paying more for energy, and that alone would pull total employment down by about 1,200 positions. Can I go to the next slide? If we add to that the business and commercial sectors encountering the higher price on dirty energy, and we didn't do anything to return any of that money to the economy, the impact of the fee alone would actually be double the household effect. It would be about 2,200 or so positions lost, and would be at this point we're talking something like 2 or 3/10% of the total employment falling. So the fee has its effect, we know that. But then we get into the next step as we go to the next slide of starting to return that fee to the economy. So if I can go on to the next. this is the reaction we get using the elasticities and the sort of long track record of data we have on how businesses and households would respond to a price change. Their response alone would basically bring back, by reducing their spending on energy and restricting it to the most high value uses, going through things like more efficient light bulbs, making the switch to smart meters and smart electricity and more efficient appliances and HVAC over time, we'd get about half of this impact back alone. So at this point, we haven't even returned any of the revenue from the tax to the economy. We've simply seen what we think the data proves out to be a fairly standard reaction to the higher cost of energy. The next slide. In this case, we added a business cost abatement. Now, this is a fairly small effect in terms of total employment, but what it really ends up doing is having sort of a contrary effect later on of helping us reduce the cost of operation. It really is more about, at this point, reducing what we feared would be a sort of a high price driver out. And we'd be pushing businesses out of the district if we did not do this. So we did see a good gain here in this case, getting back a couple hundred jobs. But also it really helped a lot of other variables perform better to put this in place. And the next slide. This is the effect of the transport policies. So we had people shifting to slightly more efficient vehicles. We had people, even though they were encountering a price at parking meters and at the parking garages, we saw the revenue coming in, doing a lot of good from the investment that was coming out of this money. So the transport policies at this point are generating revenue back into the economy. Some of that is coming from tourists and out of district commuters coming in and contributing that money into the pot, which is then reinvested within the district. So the transport policies helped us climb a little bit further back out of the hole. And the next slide. This is when we start to add in the green investment. And so at this point, we've got the city funding expansion projects, investment projects, construction work, procurement of more efficient electrical equipment, HVAC equipment for buildings throughout the region. And so this investment was a steady flow. And as you can see, really from the start to the end, that additional sort of cycling of money back into the economy is going to have its positive effect. We're still a little bit below the zero line. So these things in total have almost eaten up, but not quite offset that tax burden until we go to the final slide, which is this one. Sorry, next slide, I apologize. There's one more slide, I think. Oh, go back one, please. There we go. This is what happens when we return the bulk of that money back to the economy as a rebate directly to households. And so at this point, households have significant amounts of money, reaching something like $400 million in a given year, reallocated back out to every household in the district. That money is then in their pockets to be spent, and it has a significant effect, as you can see. We go from a situation where we were losing 400 jobs a year to a situation where we're gaining 500 in the final year there. So that's spending into all the retail sectors, as well as the responsive spending that those sellers then do in all the business to business and intermediate sectors that they buy from. That is really a significant driver in this case of several hundred to nearly 1,000 jobs by the end of the term. It was the flagship element of how this money was going to be reinvested, and it proved out through the modeling to have the most significant positive benefit to the economy. And I think we can get deeper into how this money is allocated, because there's a large discussion going on about the progressivity of it and ensuring that every income quintile is treated appropriately. But this fundamentally represents that return of most of the money back to residents, with a little bit extra going to low-income households. and the spending that they would do as a result. We always know consumer spending is a stimulus. We've seen many attempts in the last 15 years for the governments to spark that in response to recessions. Just in the 2000s, we've seen it more than once. And this is another case where we expect that to be very positive. And the next slide. And again, I want to get back to this point, which is that we're fundamentally keeping the economy about where it was. The green line represents where the baseline economy that we expected for DC in terms of total employment. The yellow line represents where we thought that policy would change it. And as you can see, they track very, very close to each other. Basically, you're seeing the same scale of economic activity. This is not a policy that's going to massively dislocate or suddenly elevate the economy by huge margins. It's a policy that's going to hold the economy in place while it delivers 20 to 25% emissions reductions under this set of assumptions. So that's really the sort of takeaway that I come to as an analyst. I think it's obviously very important to preserve that in any policy line, and we want to achieve gains where we can. This is also consistent with efficiency policies that we've run analyses on in the past. Tested about a dozen similar efficiency policies, or sort of somewhat similar efficiency policies in Pennsylvania, and this is a very common outcome. You have GDP and jobs holding fundamentally steady as you trade the spending on energy for spending in other sectors. You end up with some readjustment between which sectors gain and lose, but overall the total size of the economy typically holds pretty steady in efficiency scenarios, and that's really what this policy fundamentally is driving, is an efficiency shift. And so we're seeing that here. We've seen it in a lot of other places, and this scenario really did fit the bill, similarly to a lot of other studies of other energy efficiency policies. And the next slide. So we got a little bit further into the winners and losers here, and I wanted to sort of run through them again. We had winners being construction as a direct beneficiary, retail and other consumer-facing industries as an indirect beneficiary, that coming from the money handed out as the dividend. The insider trading tip was Best Buy or Target, anyone who sells electronics, TVs. That sector seemed to do really, really well. In the losing side, again, we saw utilities, fuel sales, so transportation fuels did go down, and we did see consultants and professional, sectors that were totally unconnected to consumer spending. Those sectors tended to suffer, but on a broader scale, it was very, very tight. Vast majority of sectors in this model, which breaks the economy out into about 70 sectors, 55 or more, saw no effect. We're talking about a change, even in the model, of less than one total job position. So really no effect at all. And this is management, administration, education, tourism, finance, lots of sectors that just don't get touched. And fundamentally, we don't see any sector growing by more than about 300 positions. So again, nobody is being chased out or added in en masse. These are small changes to the overall size of any sector. And the next slide. And that's what I thought the next one was. I'm happy to take questions, but I also want to make sure that the rest of the agenda for the call goes on, but I'm here throughout the call and beyond, of course.
Thank you so much, Scott. We got a couple of questions in, but I'm going to hold most of them till the end. There's just one that's a clarification on some acronyms. So okay. Jean Stewart asked if you could define PJM and RPS.
Very good. RPS is the Renewable Portfolio Standard for the District of Columbia, and that is an existing rule that the district has applied, which requires that its its electricity mix become cleaner over time. And I believe that the target it requires the district to hit is a 50% supply of renewable energy by, I think it's 2032. Is that right? So it basically represents an existing aggressive policy to clean up electricity, even as it is. The effect of having the RPS in place is that energy, even as this carbon fee is rising each year. So it's $20 a ton, $30 a ton, $40 a ton. And then 10 years out, it's 120, 130, 140. The fee you would see on your bill would not rise as rapidly because the electricity you're buying is already getting cleaner thanks to the RPS. So if your electricity is only about 70% as dirty at some point, the fact that the fee has doubled means that you're not going to see double the price impact on your bill because the energy is getting taxed at less and less intensity per unit that you use. So running a light bulb for an hour is not as dirty 10 years from now as it is now, even without this carbon fee and rebate. So you apply it and the fee and rebate ends up basically plateauing, even though the fee rises. The second term you described, what you asked about, was PJM. PJM is the grid interconnection. It's the exchange, electricity network exchange that covers the entire Mid-Atlantic, and it supplies energy to the district. And so we refer to PJM interconnection or interchange as the entire network of electricity suppliers and transmitters and distributors, including PEPCO in our case. So it's very large. It's the largest one in the country, and as a result, DC is a relatively small total consumer out of that mix.
Great, thank you so much. So we had a couple other questions come in, but I'm going to hold those for the end because I think that they'll apply when we take all of the questions. So I'm going to move on to Richard Graves. We'd love to have you share your business perspective.
Absolutely, and I think an important part of this is that fundamentally DC consumers want clean energy. That's something that has been borne out by our company, our experience in market, the folks we talk to, the organizations we work with, and policies like this, I think, help at the end of the day get more clean energy in the district, get more ways of people accessing it, and makes the benefits kind of more broadly distributed. So let me talk just a little bit about our company. So I'm the Chief Impact Officer and co-founder of CleanChoice Energy. CleanChoice Energy is a leading regional renewable energy supplier. We are headquartered here in Washington, D.C., and we serve 8 states in Washington, D.C. Consumers, both residential and businesses, with 100% renewable energy. We've only ever offered 100% renewable energy, and our mission has been to make clean energy available to everybody since day one, as well as to address, the impacts of catastrophic climate change and build a healthier, more prosperous future for all. So we're really in support of policies like this. I think the critical part of this policy, and we've seen kind of the impact that's kind of modeled on this, and I think the part that is maybe not addressed as much, which is currently today in Washington, D.C., CleanChoice Energy has thousands of residential customers and hundreds of commercial customers who get 100% renewable energy from us. And these are folks who've preferentially stepped up and said, I want to make the world a cleaner place. And in fact, Washington, D.C. is the #1 community in the entire country for procuring clean energy. Not California, not Hawaii, not some of the places that get a lot of press, but actually Washington, D.C. And it's been recognized nationally by the EPA and other organizations for their leadership. And I think what that really means is those are the folks who are saying, I'm willing to pay a little more so that my community gets healthier air, cleaner communities. We don't have the impacts of fracking and coal power and fossil fuels and asthma that plagues, cities like Washington. And, I think that's really important. That's something to be honored and respected. And what this fee does is it takes, I think, a very science-based approach, a very rational approach to sort of saying, if everyone's getting these benefits, the folks who have chosen to get 100% clean energy, who are going even further than the RPS. The RPS, even in 2032, only reaches 50% of the U.S. electricity market for DC, and says, hey, everyone has to buy half clean energy, but people can get 100% today. And those folks are not necessarily subject to a fee on their clean energy because they've already purchased it, they've taken that leadership role. And everyone else has a small fee, which ends up really perhaps getting passed through, but as you see kind of the modeling, kind of reducing a little bit the role of the utilities and moving more resources and more support to clean energy companies and their customers. And what I think that shows is, DC is becoming increasingly a center of clean energy entrepreneurship, clean energy innovation. We've seen leading companies like the leading energy efficiency finance software company in the United States is actually in Adams Morgan here in Washington, D.C. We saw, Solar United Neighbors, which is a group that helps local communities get access to solar cheaper and more efficiently as a nonprofit, start as a co-op in Mount Pleasant, D.C., and now is a national organization leading on this. So I think these policies don't just make D.C. much greener at actually a net positive for modeling and economics. It also establishes DC as a place where clean energy consumers kind of are on a little bit more of a level playing field, so that everyone is bearing some of the climate, environmental, health impacts of coal and fossil fuels and others that DC has been consuming. And DC is a growing, generation sector in the city, and it's almost all solar power. And the fact is that, in a city with height limits and height restrictions, it's kind of, and such strong policies towards solar, it's a little silly we don't have even more solar. And so we've seen community solar and other things come out. I think policies like these could really promote much more investment in renewable energy generation, in new enterprises and expansion of clean energy companies all around it. And I think the thousands of DC customers, businesses, when the price difference between 100% clean energy and kind of the default dirty power mix shrinks a little, we've seen many people are right on the edge saying, I really want to get clean energy, but maybe, if it's an extra, $5 a month, I could do it, but if it's an extra 15, maybe that's a little much. And a policy like this rapidly closes that gap, puts people on more level playing field, and we think a lot more households and businesses than even modeled would choose 100% clean energy and are willing to pay a little bit more if they had the choice. And I think this policy, therefore, could even accelerate more savings climate-wise than we expect, promote more clean energy development and sales than we expected. And that's actually been the history of other policies like this, which have modeled, modest, job and economic gains and actually have led to quite large ones. The clean energy sector is one of the fastest growing sectors in the United States. 1 out of 12 jobs since the financial crisis has been created in the clean energy industry. And so many of those gains have gone to California, but we're increasingly seeing places like DC that have the right combination can be a beneficiary of this. So I think there's a lot of benefits to the city. I think it's a really smart policy that also finds a way so that tourists and others who use a lot of the infrastructure of DC do pay a share of this and help green up the city. And I think it will spark a whole bunch of knock-on effects that the city will look back and say, this was a really smart thing. And we really built up a whole new sector that has built a lot of innovation and benefits for the city beyond just the climate and environmental benefits, which I think are incredibly important, especially in a city that's riven by a lot of inequality and where a lot of communities are still suffering from really high health impacts from everything from asthma to some of the environmental impacts, and we need funding to address them.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. And then next is Nicole Rentz, who's the Legislative Director for Councilwoman Cheh, and she's going to be talking to us a little bit about what the council is looking for to hear from business.
Hi. I'm Nicole Rentz, and I'm the Legislative and Committee Director for Councilmember Cheh. I'd say CCAN's efforts have been sort of focused on her with regard to this proposal, and ever since they came forward with the RIMI study, she's become more and more interested and excited about it. We are sort of looking at this from a political standpoint because we have to be. If we don't, we'd like to support something that actually is able to pass through the council. So we're looking a lot at, what the costs are on various district stakeholders. I agree that there is a lot of support in the district for clean energy policies, but when you start talking about raising people's energy bills significantly, there's definitely we're going to see some pushback. So, we've taken some of this information and tried to estimate some of the costs, and have gotten some information from Camila and Remy, and we're the estimates for the first year of this policy would be that the average commercial bills would increase by about $135 a month, or $1,600 a year, and obviously that increases by about 5 times through the life of the policy. So obviously, there will be strong effects on businesses, and we expect to hear from them, especially given that I think businesses will be contributing about 67% of the fund that is developed from these fees, and residents will be getting back 75%, and businesses will be getting back 5%. So we anticipate that there will be some concern about that sort of imbalance, and people will want, maybe we'll end up with, more investment in business, rebates, rather than in sort of green programming, which would be more of a grant type thing, which would have defined winners and losers. So what we'd like to hear from you, given that you're a group of businesses that's obviously more forward thinking, and perhaps this policy won't affect many of you because you've already taken steps to green your energy supply or use, and but to the extent that you haven't and you're still using traditional energy sources, we'd like to hear what you anticipate the effects to be. And given that if we give back 5% of the revenue to businesses, which would be about $7 million, or 20%, which would be about $28 million in the first year, what do you anticipate would be the best way for you to get that money back? How would it be most beneficial and most useful for you? Would it be something like a tax credit, which seems to me like the most obvious and easiest way for businesses to get that stuff back? Maybe a refundable tax credit. So I'd be interested in hearing any ideas you might have along those lines. And that's about all that I have to say. So thanks, and I look forward to hearing from you guys.
Great. Thank you so much, Nicole. So we're going to move into the question period, and then also if you have a response to Nicole, you can submit it through the chat function as well, and we'll make sure that all of those responses are shared. So I'm going to pass over to my coworker, Ryan, who's going to read out the question.
Thanks, Eliza. We've got a few in here. The first we'll read comes from Sarah Harper, founder and executive director for Noble Growth Network and ASBC member. Hello, Sarah. And the question is about concerns with harming the economy and those who are less fortunate. And the question is about how do we make sure that this money goes back to the people of DC and doesn't just get reallocated by politicians or other groups looking for extra pots of cash. And I'll leave that out for anyone who wants to answer.
This is Richard. One thing I do want to say I think is really important about a policy like this is there is options for folks, and just like for example, Nicole was mentioning businesses paying. A business that signs up for clean energy today wouldn't be liable for let's say the tax on the electricity, And I think that's really important to remember is that businesses often get preferential rates as larger buyers of energy than consumers do. And so in many ways, them signing up for clean energy often is quite close to what the current energy rate is with the tax. In many cases, clean energy might be at parity or sometimes even cheaper than what electricity may be. So I think that there might be a effect of a lot of businesses signing up for clean energy where the economics are more attractive and therefore wouldn't have necessarily as high an impact on them annually. And we've seen that with hundreds of businesses that we've talked to, that in many cases they think clean energy is much more expensive than it actually is, partly because of just the expansion of the market. And then, I think as this policy is targeted back to consumers and others, I think because a lot of businesses will have the option to kind of control the energy costs by switching to clean energy and having access to more of these wholesale energy options. And then we're seeing the Solar for All program and others, which is really targeting a lot of the customers most in need with lower cost solar power using some of the other solar programs in DC. I think the intersection between those two policies can be really beneficial. And in many ways, even if the actual cost of a kilowatt hour goes up, when people are covering a lot of bills via things like community solar, the Solar for All program, and others, which is targeted at more 100,000 lower income households in DC, it actually can magnify those effects in some really important ways.
Great, thanks. Our next question comes from Nicole Whalen, who asks, can you please unpack what a vehicle excise tax looks like?
Yeah, this is Scott. I think I can speak to that. It's actually an adjustment to the existing vehicle excise tax, or the way I laid it out. And this was my attempt to apply one that I thought that's been sort of well measured and tested in the past. And it's not necessarily a policy prescription that I'm advocating, but it's basically a variable that looks at the fuel efficiency of the vehicle being brought to the district. If it's better than average, your excise tax actually goes down. And if it's worse than average, your excise tax goes up. The idea would be to do the up and the down adjustments in a way that would be revenue neutral to the city. So people buying more efficient vehicles would save as much money as the people buying less efficient vehicles would be required to spend. By way of context, right now, when you bring a car into the district, whether it's new or used, you basically pay between 6 and 8% of that vehicle's value to the city when you do so. And so that could be several $1,000s on an expensive new vehicle that's a very heavy, because it's based on the size of the vehicle. So a very large, very expensive new vehicle could cost several $1,000s. This shift, which basically I use trying to think back, I used the CAFE standard, the forecast CAFE standards, and I adjusted them based on the projected efficiencies of vehicle types running out into the future. This shift could either add something like 50% to that for a very, very inefficient vehicle, or it could actually reduce that excise tax by about 50% for a very efficient hybrid or other vehicle that's able to achieve very good fuel efficiency. Happy to share more details on exactly how that was laid out in the analysis, but fundamentally it's a revenue neutral adjustment to the existing excise tax so that efficient vehicles would pay way less and inefficient vehicles would pay significantly more.
Great. Still got a few minutes left, so I'll read another question here. And also, if we have any businesses on the line that want to provide their comments or feedback to Nicole and the DC Council, we'll welcome those as well. You can use the Ask a Question feature or raise your hand in the software. Next question I have is from Gene Stewart, who asks, what would be the impact on management companies who manage large-scale rental properties? How can they be incentivized to go solar?
Well, this is Scott. I think the first and foremost incentive will simply be that there are far smaller utility taxes on the electricity. The fee charged on a large building would be substantially less for a building that's gone solar or which has purchased a clean energy alternative for electricity. The the way my understanding is of these contracts, having signed a couple commercial leases now myself, is that the bills, even on master meter buildings, do get passed through assessments to the tenants. And so the buildings that do take these measures would be more competitive over time, because they'd be able to offer, even if they charge the same rate per square foot on real estate, they would be offering a lower price on utilities as part of those assessed adders that go on to on top of the monthly rent charge to their commercial tenants. And so a large building with hundreds of thousands of square feet charging a large tenant, let's say an anchor tenant, also with hundreds of thousands of square feet, that could be quite a significant chunk of money. And I think the return on investment, even if it's not returned in a single year, would be returned far faster in both cases. And so the owner of the building would have the incentive of being more competitive, and then to the extent the large tenants wanted to be could be brought in to the game, they could probably even share the cost. That would be a contracting arrangement that they would figure out on their own. But there's a significant savings to be had, and once that savings is present, I think it's, the incentive is there to find a way to make it happen, whether it's paid for by the tenant or the landlord.
This is Richard. I think there's three scenarios here with the commercial landlord. Basically, if you are renting to residential customers who are not individually metered, because of the return of the rebate, they would actually, frankly, be more cash in their pockets for this, which would be a net positive. It's a triple net situation where the tenant is responsible for the energy but has little control. I think in those scenarios, there's a lot of cases where either the building should really look at procuring a low-cost commercial clean energy product, which can be more beneficial and attractive. We've seen huge growth in green building in DC, as well as commercial procurements of clean energy, which both becomes a benefit. In this case, could actually, some cases, provide savings versus what energy would be without it. And then, where the tenant is kind of on the hook because they're just paying it through square foot and it's not part of a triple net in a commercial, that gives a lot of incentives because of the way things work, is to actually allow tenant improvement budgets to work with things like DCSEU on energy efficiency and others that can benefit, actually, frankly, can both increase and make those tenant improvement budgets go further, while actually providing a lower cost to operate the building to the owner of the commercial building, and can be kind of a win-win. As well as community solar, I think increasingly is a really good option, where someone can build it on, let's say, a larger roof that might not be available, but if you have a lot of demand, you can provide savings to tenants who are sub-metered, not metered, triple net, or if they're not, you could potentially just lower the operating cost of the building.
Great, thank you so much. So that was our last question. If there's any other questions that people have before we sign off, send them in now. But I really want to reiterate Nicole's question to the group of what kind of business benefit would be the best for your business if this policy were implemented. I think this is a really great opportunity for businesses to be able to share their perspective and what would really be good for them with the council, a really great way to get involved with the policymaking process. And I know that that might take some time to think about. So if you do have a thought or a question and you'd really like to get in touch, feel free to email me. My email's up on the screen right now, and I can put you in touch with Nicole or any of the other people who have so generously participated in this presentation. So maybe after you hang up, think about that a little bit more and then write us back, because I think it would be a really great way to help design that business. Oh, it looks like we did have one suggestion come in. This is from Nicole Whalen, and she suggested offering a tax credit for electric vehicles and reinvesting electric vehicle charging stations via a PPP. I'm not sure what that acronym stands for.
Public-private partnership, I think, is what they mean.
Oh, public-private partnership. Thank you. That came in from Nicole as well. Thanks, Nicole. So that's one suggestion. If there are others, please share them with us. And then my last thing is just thank you all for participating today. Thank you especially to our speakers, Nicole, Richard, Scott, Asada, and Camila. You were really great. If you have any questions following the presentation or anything you'd like to listen to again, we'll be putting this up on our website later today or tomorrow, so you'll be able to access the entire presentation. And we'll also be sending out some more information about the proposal in a follow-up email, so be looking for that. And then finally, again, I'll just mention we have our summit coming up, so if this is an issue you're really interested in doing some advocacy on at the federal level, let me know. And if you think of anything else following the presentation, please feel free to reach out. Thank you so much for participating, and we'll be in touch shortly with more information.